Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're floating into one of those topics that feels like it belongs in a dusty fantasy novel, but annoyingly enough for historians, it actually happened. So if you're curled up under a blanket, the lights are dim, maybe you've got a cup of tea that's already gone cold. Perfect, because tonight's story is not about battles, or politics, or dates you'll never remember. It's about the kinds of weird little myths from the Middle Ages that people swore were just legends, until someone actually found proof that they were unfortunately very real. And of course, because this is medieval history, most of these myths involve royals who were inbred, sickly, or just very bad at making life choices, which is sort of their thing. Let's ease into it slowly. The Viking Sunstone, a rock for people who hated maps. So, let's begin with the Vikings. Because when in doubt, start with some large Scandinavian men who liked boats and questionable hairstyles. For centuries, there was this myth in the Icelandic sagas about a magical crystal, the Sunstone. Allegedly, Viking navigators could hold this stone up to the sky, and even when it was overcast, it would somehow reveal where the sun was. Which is suspicious, because medieval Europe was not exactly producing crystal-based GPS technology. For a long time, historians rolled their eyes. The sagas are full of exaggerations. They make ordinary farmers sound like demigods, and drunken bar fights sound like epic poetry. So the idea of a magic navigation rock felt a bit too Dungeons and Dragons to take seriously. But then in 2013, a group of archaeologists poking around a shipwreck off the coast of England found a crystal. Not just any crystal. It was a chunk of Iceland spar, also known as calcite. And it just so happens that when you look through calcite, it splits light into two beams, making it possible to detect the sun's position, even when it's cloudy. So yes, the Vikings really were wandering around the North Atlantic with magic crystals, or at least crystals that worked a little like sunglasses mixed with witchcraft. And suddenly the myth was true. Of course, this raises another question. If the Vikings had such advanced navigation tricks, how did half of them still get lost and end up in Newfoundland, or Greenland, or just drowned? The answer is probably that they were still Vikings. They had the rock, but they also had ale, bad weather, and a talent for poor judgment. So next time you hear about the Viking Sunstone, just imagine some bearded sailor holding up a shiny rock like it's the medieval equivalent of Google Maps, and then steering his ship directly into the wrong fjord anyway. Troy, a city that refused to stay legendary. Now let's drift south. For centuries, everyone thought the story of Troy was pure myth. Just Homer being Homer. The Iliad, the Odyssey, all great bedtime stories but not real. After all, the tale of the Trojan War involves a suspiciously beautiful woman, a wooden horse filled with sweaty men, and gods constantly interrupting like annoying neighbors. Not exactly the kind of thing you expect to find in an archaeological record. But in the 1870s, along came Heinrich Schliemann. He was not exactly the world's most careful archaeologist. More like the world's most enthusiastic treasure hunter with a spade. But, in his messy way, he dug into a hill in Turkey called Hisarlik. And what he found was layer after layer of cities stacked on top of each other, like an ancient lasagna. One of those layers matched up almost perfectly with the time period described in the Legends of Troy. The city walls were massive. There were signs of a great fire, broken weapons, basically the kind of evidence you'd expect from a place where someone may have very unwisely dragged in a suspiciously large wooden horse. So the myth wasn't really a myth. Troy was real. It had been sitting quietly under the dirt, waiting for a German guy with too much money to come along and destroy, half of it in the process of proving himself right. And of course, European aristocrats loved this discovery, because it meant all their fancy, classical education wasn't just built on fiction. Their bedtime stories were sort of accurate, which gave them a sense of superiority. Until you remember that these are the same people who later went around Europe building fake, ruined castles in their gardens, because they thought it looked chic. The Leper King, medieval gossip with receipts. Speaking of things people thought were exaggerated, medieval accounts of leprosy. Chroniclers made it sound like half the nobility were constantly falling apart, which some modern historians thought was just symbolic, a way to describe someone as spiritually corrupt. But then DNA evidence came along. Archaeologists started digging up medieval cemeteries, running genetic tests, and yep, turns out leprosy really was everywhere. And some of the most famous figures of the Middle Ages actually had it. Take King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, known to history as the Leper King. For centuries, some people thought that was just a cruel nickname or maybe propaganda. But modern medical examinations of skeletal remains from his era confirmed that leprosy was rampant in the Crusader states, so Baldwin probably did have it, which makes his reign both impressive and kind of tragic. Imagine trying to run a kingdom, fight off Saladin, and also slowly lose your fingers. Not exactly a dream job, and yet medieval chroniclers love to romanticize him. Because nothing says chivalric tragedy like a teenager king with a wasting disease. His short, painful reign became legendary, a myth in itself, until science stepped in and gave us the depressing confirmation that yes, he really was that sick. Vinland. Vikings accidentally discover America. Let's drift back north, because the Vikings were nothing if not persistent at making history weird. The Icelandic sagas mention a place called Vinland, supposedly discovered by Leif Erikson around the year 1000. The descriptions sound suspiciously like North America: wild grapes, strange forests, and encounters with local people. For centuries, scholars debated whether this was real. Surely the Vikings hadn't actually crossed the Atlantic. That was Columbus's job, 5 centuries later. But then, in the 1960s, a Norwegian couple named Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad stumbled upon a site at Lanceau, Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. They found the remains of Norse-style houses, iron nails, and other artifacts that definitely did not belong to indigenous peoples of the region. So yes, the sagas were telling the truth. The Vikings had been there, they just weren't very good at staying. Probably because Newfoundland is cold. The locals were not thrilled to see them, and the Vikings themselves were a bit allergic to peace and quiet. So the myth of Vinland became history. And in the process, poor Columbus lost his first European in America badge. Sorry, Chris. Turns out you were late to the party as usual. Pause and float. And maybe let's pause here for a moment. We've drifted from Viking rocks, to ancient cities, to diseased kings, and back again to Vikings who couldn't commit to colonizing Canada. That's the thing about medieval myths. They sound fake. They feel like bedtime stories. But then archaeology or science comes along and confirms them. And suddenly the past feels a lot closer and a lot weirder. In the next part, we'll float over to some royals whose entire lives basically became myths, and who, thanks to their bad genetics, emotional breakdowns, or just questionable decisions, left behind stories that seemed too bizarre to be true. Until, annoyingly, they were. So, let's gently drift onward. Royal myths that turned out to be uncomfortably true. Hey again, if you're still awake, congratulations. Or maybe condolences. Either way, let's sink further into the candlelit haze of medieval myths. Gossip and dynastic disasters that people swore were just stories. Until history, archaeology, or sheer genetic evidence stepped in to prove them right. Because here's the thing. When it comes to royalty, the line between legend and awkward family medical history is very, very thin. Charles II of Spain, the myth of the bewitched king. So let's begin with Charles II of Spain, also known as El Hechizado, the bewitched. For centuries, stories circulated that Charles was the product of so much Habsburg inbreeding that he basically wasn't a functional human being. Chroniclers described him as grotesque, weak, drooling, and incapable of ruling. And for a long time, people thought those accounts had to be exaggerated. Medieval gossips loved to tear monarchs apart. Maybe the poor guy just had bad PR. But then modern historians looked at his family tree. And, oh boy, let's just say the Habsburgs really took keeping it in the family to Olympic levels. Charles's parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were also heavily interrelated. By the time Charles was born, his genetic diversity was about as rich as a puddle in the desert. And the physical evidence matched the myth. Contemporary portraits show him with the famous Habsburg jaw, a chin so long and drooping it looked like it belonged in a cartoon. He couldn't chew properly. He didn't walk until he was 8. He didn't speak until he was 4. And in case the dynasty wasn't doomed enough already, he was sterile. So yes, the myth of the bewitched king turned out to be true. Not because of sorcery, just because of centuries of cousins, marrying cousins until the family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tangled shoelace. And naturally, the Habsburg court responded to all of this with superstition. They genuinely thought Charles had been cursed. Priests performed exorcisms. Doctors recommended magic potions, as if the real curse wasn't just marrying your niece. Richard the Lionheart, mythical warrior, awkward reality. Now, let's glide over to England. Richard the Lionheart, the hero king, the ultimate knight, the guy every Hollywood scriptwriter wants to put in shiny armor. The myth, Richard was this dashing, noble warrior, beloved by his people, off fighting glorious crusades while Robin Hood protected the homeland. The reality: Richard barely set foot in England. He hated the place. He saw it as a piggy bank to fund his endless wars in France and the Holy Land. He spoke French, not English, and when he wasn't away fighting, he was usually locked in some dungeon because he annoyed the wrong duke. Even his famous reputation as a great warrior has asterisks. Yes, he fought bravely, but he also had a habit of bankrupting his kingdom, alienating allies, and then leaving his little brother John to clean up the mess. Which admittedly, John did terribly. But that's another story. So the myth of Richard the Lionheart was partly true. He was brave. He was skilled. But he was also deeply irresponsible. Occasionally reckless, and almost never at home. The England of Robin Hood needed a king, and Richard was usually in Cyprus. Isabella of France, the she-wolf who wasn't just gossip. Next up, Isabella of France, nicknamed the She-Wolf of France. Which sounds like a cool metal band, but in reality, it was just the medieval press giving her a bad girl reputation. The myth was that Isabella, frustrated with her weak husband Edward II of England, conspired with her lover Roger Mortimer to overthrow him, and possibly to have him murdered in a very, let's say, uncomfortable way involving a hot poker. For centuries, that story was treated as lurid legend. Surely no medieval queen would go that far, but the facts line up suspiciously well. Edward II really was overthrown by Isabella and Mortimer. He really was imprisoned, and his death was sudden, mysterious, and covered up with excuses about him conveniently falling ill, which, in medieval political code, usually means we did something, don't ask. Modern historians don't fully buy the hot poker detail. It smells like propaganda, but Isabella's role in deposing her husband was very real. So the myth of the she-wolf wasn't entirely fantasy. She was ambitious, ruthless, and quite possibly lethal, which, in fairness, might have been the only way to survive medieval politics. So maybe the wolf nickname was unfair, but she certainly wasn't a lamb. The Dancing Plague of 1518. Mythical madness confirmed. Okay, this one is technically early modern, but close enough to medieval vibes that we're counting it. The Dancing Plague. Strasbourg, 1518, supposedly. A woman named Frau Trophea walked into the street and started dancing. And she didn't stop. For days. Soon dozens of other people joined her. And within weeks, hundreds of people were dancing uncontrollably. Some until they literally dropped dead. For a long time, this story sounded like a wild urban legend. The kind of thing medieval chroniclers made up because they were bored. But records from the city council survive. Doctors wrote about it. Orders were issued to hire musicians because the authorities thought maybe the dancers just needed to dance it out, which is a medical strategy you won't find in many textbooks. So yes, the myth was true. The dancing plague really happened. Modern scholars think it was probably a case of mass hysteria triggered by stress, famine, and maybe ergot poisoning from moldy bread. But still, the image of hundreds of medieval townsfolk twitching and spinning themselves into collapse is one of those things that feels too bizarre to be real. And yet it was. Of course, the authorities made it worse. Instead of telling people to rest, they built stages, hired bands, and encouraged the dancing. Because if people are collapsing in the streets, clearly the solution is more cowbell. Vlad the Impaler, the myth behind Dracula. And because no medieval myth list would be complete without him. Vlad III of Wallachia, also known as Vlad the Impaler, also known as the very loose inspiration for Dracula. The myth, Vlad was a blood-drinking monster who killed tens of thousands of enemies by impaling them on stakes, creating forests of corpses. The reality, yeah, pretty much. Contemporary Ottoman sources, German pamphlets, and even Wallachian chronicles describe Vlad's favorite hobby as impaling people. Sometimes slowly, sometimes creatively. He wasn't literally drinking blood, but he was definitely bathing in the reputation of cruelty. Of course, like most rulers, he also had fans. Some locals saw him as a strong leader who defended their land from the Ottomans. But to everyone else, he was the stuff of nightmares. So when Bram Stoker later borrowed his name for a gothic vampire novel, the association stuck. Vlad wasn't a literal vampire, but he didn't really need to be. He was already terrifying enough without the fangs. Quiet drift. And here we pause again. From bewitched kings with inbred jaws, to lion-hearted warriors who hated England, to dancing plagues and she-wolves. It's a reminder that medieval myths often weren't myths at all. They were just history, written in the most dramatic, sarcastic, or exaggerated language possible. But behind the gossip, behind the legends, They were always very real people, often sad, often sickly, often making terrible decisions, which is, in its own way, the most medieval thing of all. In the next part, we'll keep floating into even stranger myths about children, dynasties, and rulers who left behind stories so ridiculous you'd think they were made up. But of course, they weren't. So let's drift onward. Hey again, if you're still here, either you're trying to fall asleep, or you're the type who genuinely enjoys learning how inbred medieval royals were. Either way, you're in the right place. Tonight we float further into the strange space where medieval myths about royal families turn out to be painfully true. Because honestly, nothing produces myths faster than a dynasty full of overprotected, underprepared children who accidentally run kingdoms like they're playing with wooden toys. Edward the Black Prince, the shiny myth that died early. So let's start with Edward of Woodstock. You probably know him as the Black Prince, the myth. He was England's ultimate medieval warrior, a dazzling knight in black armor, a hero of the 100 Years' War. And yes, some of that was true. He fought at Crécy, he fought at Poitiers. He captured the French king in battle, which is basically the medieval version of hitting a home run at the World Series. But the awkward part? He never actually became king. He was the heir to Edward III, but he died before his father, which left the crown to his young son, Richard II, who was not exactly a success story. And then there's the personal side of Edward himself. Contemporary chroniclers gushed about him, but modern research suggests he may have been chronically ill in his last years. Some think he had dysentery. Others suggest kidney disease. Either way, the shining myth of the Black Prince faded into a sad reality of a sickly man who never wore the crown. It's a reminder that even the brightest medieval legends were fragile. One bad illness, and the myth collapses into a damp historical footnote. The Princes in the Tower, myth meets mystery. Speaking of tragic royal children, let's wander to the Tower of London. The story of the Princes in the Tower is one of the most famous medieval mysteries. Edward V, age 12, and his younger brother Richard, age 9, were lodged in the Tower in 1483 after their father, Edward IV, died. Their uncle, Richard of Gloucester, was supposed to protect them. Instead, he declared them illegitimate, took the throne as Richard III, and the boys vanished. For centuries, it was treated as scandalous rumor. Did Richard kill them? Did someone else? Were they smuggled away? Tudor propaganda loved to paint Richard as a child-murdering villain. His defenders claimed it was all lies, but in 1674, workers at the tower found a wooden chest buried under a staircase. Inside were 2 small skeletons. The bones were reburied in Westminster Abbey as the likely remains of the princes. Later scientific tests weren't conclusive, but they were consistent with the ages of the boys. So the myth had teeth. The princes were almost certainly murdered. By whom we may never know. But the idea that Richard III was innocent, that one looks shakier every century. And yet, Shakespeare couldn't resist turning the story into Gothic tragedy, because what's more medieval than a hunchbacked king supposedly suffocating his nephews? History meets horror play. Margaret Beaufort, the pious mother myth. And since we're in the Wars of the Roses, let's drift to Margaret Beaufort. For centuries, she was portrayed as the perfect, pious, devoted mother. The myth of the saintly matriarch who spent her life fasting, praying, and plotting only for her son Henry Tudor's success. Which is true, sort of. But modern historians have pointed out that Margaret was also one of the most ruthlessly ambitious women of the late Middle Ages. She married young, endured multiple arranged unions, and somehow always came out with more political leverage than before. By the time Henry won at Bosworth in 1485, Margaret was styled My Lady the King's Mother, and in practice, she wielded almost as much influence as her son. So yes, she was devout, but the myth of the saintly, passive medieval mother misses the point. She was also one of the sharpest political operators of her time, which is why her descendants got to sit on the throne for centuries. The Mad King of France, Charles VI. Now let's glide over to France. Because if there's one myth medieval chroniclers loved, it was calling kings insane. Charles VI of France was nicknamed Charles the Mad, and for centuries, his mental illness was wrapped in myth. People claimed he thought he was made of glass, that he forgot his own name, that he ran through corridors howling like a wolf. The reality? Most of that is true. Starting in his mid-20s, Charles suffered repeated bouts of psychosis. He sometimes failed to recognize his own family. He claimed he was made of brittle glass and refused to be touched. At one point, he massacred his own attendants in a paranoid fit. This wasn't just court gossip. Surviving records show the French court struggled for decades to govern while the king was incapacitated. His reign left France politically fractured, opening the door for English advances in the 100 Years' War. So yes, the myth of the Glass King was accurate, and it's one of those sad reminders that behind the medieval crown was often a very vulnerable human being. Unfortunately, one with a whole kingdom depending on him. The dancing mania of royal children. You may remember the dancing plague we floated through earlier. Well, it wasn't the only case. Medieval records mention smaller dancing manias, some of which included noble households. Children of the aristocracy were sometimes described as struck by uncontrollable movements, twitching, or hours of skipping and spinning. Later generations dismissed these as exaggerations, but modern medicine has suggested they may have been outbreaks of neurological illness, possibly linked to Sydenham's chorea or ergot poisoning, which means the creepy stories of possessed children may have been real medical events. Imagine being a medieval courtier, watching the king's heirs start twitching in rhythm, and having no explanation beyond the devil did it, which naturally became the myth. The sickly Tudor children. Every myth had a body count. If you want proof that myths of fragile royal children were real, just look at the Tudors. Henry VIII's obsession with producing a male heir is legendary, but the part people forget is that his wives did actually produce multiple children. They just mostly didn't survive. Catherine of Aragon had at least 6 pregnancies. Only one child, Mary, lived past infancy. Anne Boleyn gave birth to Elizabeth, but also suffered miscarriages. Jane Seymour produced Edward VI, who himself was so frail and sickly that he died at 15. For centuries, rumors circulated about curses, divine punishment, or bad luck. In reality, the Tudor dynasty was simply a medieval genetic and medical disaster zone. Malnutrition, disease, and inbreeding didn't help. So the myth of the fragile Tudor heirs wasn't just propaganda. It was tragically accurate, which makes it almost funny, in a bleak way, that Henry VIII broke from Rome, dissolved monasteries, and rewrote England's entire religious life, all because his children kept dying. Talk about world history shaped by a series of tragic nursery failures. Quiet drift. And here we pause again. We've drifted through myths of glass kings, missing princes, pious mothers, and sickly dynasties. Each one wrapped in legend, gossip, or propaganda. Each one turning out, inconveniently, to be rooted in truth. It's almost comforting in a weird way. Medieval people weren't making things up. They were just reporting reality in the only language they had. Mythic, dramatic, slightly hysterical. But behind those myths were real royals. Often sad, often sick, and often dragged into stories they didn't choose, but couldn't escape. In the next part, we'll keep floating into even stranger myths about curses, omens, and dynastic superstitions that turned out to be far too real for comfort. So let's drift onward. So let's float back into our medieval haze. We've talked about kings and parking lots of bones. We've talked about phantom battles that somehow became history. Now let's gently wander into the dynastic gossip corner, because no medieval myth collection would be complete without royals, who were either too dramatic, too unlucky, or too inbred for their own good. And yes, of course, their personal PR departments, meaning court, chroniclers, loved to embroider things, until reality basically vanished. The legend of Juana la Loca, aka Joanna the Mad. Let's start with Juana of Castile, nicknamed the Mad, because if you're a 16th century woman who doesn't quietly accept your lot, congratulations, you're automatically insane. The myth goes something like this. Juana was so obsessed with her husband, Philip the Handsome, that after his death she refused to bury him. Instead, she supposedly dragged his coffin around Spain, opening it up from time to time just to check if he was still handsome. Romantic in a creepy necrophilia kind of way. But was it true? Well, yes and no. What we know. Philip died suddenly in 1506, probably from typhoid. Juana was devastated, understandably, since he was not only her husband, but also a major political connection in Europe. And yes, she did travel with his body for months across Castile. But the reason wasn't just romance, it was also politics. Moving the coffin allowed her to show her claim to the throne while parading her grief in front of her people. The whole "she opened the coffin to kiss him" thing? That's almost certainly exaggerated propaganda, mostly pushed by people who wanted to sideline her and put her father Ferdinand, or later her son Charles V, in power. But the myth of the crazed widow worked wonders for her enemies. So, was Juana mad? Maybe a little eccentric, maybe depressive, but probably not nearly as coffin-kissing bonkers as the story makes her out to be. the myth of Charles the Bald's hair. Next, let's float over to the Carolingians. There's this great story about Charles II of West Francia, called the Bald. Obviously, you imagine a shiny, bare dome reflecting candlelight in some Frankish monastery. Except, we're not actually sure he was bald at all. Some sources suggest it was more of a mocking nickname than a literal description. Medieval chroniclers had a nasty habit of ironic nicknames, like calling someone the Fat when they weren't particularly overweight, or the Bold when they were basically a nervous wreck. One theory is that Charles was actually covered in hair and the nickname was a sarcastic jab, basically medieval bullying. Another theory is that he was bald, because he had been forced into clerical tonsure as a child, then later returned to royal life. Either way, the myth of a naturally bald king is shakier than his grip on his territories. So, once again, medieval nicknames, not to be trusted. The story of Edward II and the red-hot poker. Edward the Suit of England, one of the most infamous medieval monarchs, mostly because of his supposedly gruesome death. The story goes like this. In 1327, after being deposed by his wife Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer, poor Edward was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, and instead of being executed like a normal deposed king, he was allegedly killed by having a red-hot poker shoved into, well, let's just say the less royal end of the body. It's lurid, it's shocking, and it's exactly the kind of story chroniclers love to repeat. But is it true? Historians are pretty skeptical. The whole poker detail shows up in later sources, decades after Edward's death. Earlier accounts just say he died mysteriously in prison. Some even claim he may have escaped and lived on in obscurity. The poker myth probably spread because Edward was widely mocked for being unmanly by medieval standards. He liked manual labor, rowing boats, and hanging out with lower-class favorites. So, of course, chroniclers decided to invent a humiliating death that matched his supposed sins. In reality, we'll never know exactly how he died, but the poker story is almost certainly a medieval invention, designed more for entertainment than accuracy. The Sleeping Emperor Barbarossa. Now, let's take a gentle drift into German folklore. Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor in the 12th century, was a big deal in his lifetime, but the real myth about him comes after his death. According to legend, Barbarossa didn't actually die during the Third Crusade. In 1190, spoiler, he drowned while crossing a river. Instead, people claimed he was just sleeping inside a mountain, specifically Kyffhäuser Mountain in Germany. And one day when Germany really needed him, he would rise again, beard grown through the stone table in front of him, to restore the empire to glory. It's basically the German version of King Arthur, a once-and-future emperor snoozing away underground. Was there proof? Not really, but the myth stuck for centuries, even in the 19th century. During the rise of German nationalism, people were still whispering about Barbarossa coming back. Spoiler, he didn't, but the myth is still so strong that tourists today visit the Kyffhäuser monument just to imagine the old emperor snoring beneath their feet. Eleanor of Aquitaine's alleged witchcraft. Let's close this section with Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and fascinating women of the Middle Ages, Duchess of Aquitaine, Queen of both France and England, mother of Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland, basically the medieval Beyoncé, but with more castles. She was so powerful that rumors naturally grew around her. One myth claimed she was literally a witch. Why? Because she was beautiful, politically savvy, and not afraid to go toe-to-toe with kings. That, in the medieval playbook, basically equals sorcery. There's even a bizarre story that she once brought a magical love potion to her marriage with Henry II of England. When their marriage inevitably fell apart, people said it was because the potion had worn off, which honestly sounds like a medieval way of saying the honeymoon period is over. No evidence, of course. Just misogyny wrapped in superstition. But the myth of Eleanor the Enchantress floated around for centuries, which just shows how badly the Middle Ages handled ambitious women. And so, as we drift further into the night, we see a pattern. Myths about royals weren't just bedtime stories. They were tools, political weapons, smear campaigns, and occasionally, wishful thinking. Sometimes a myth hid a kernel of truth. Other times it was just the medieval version of gossip blogs. But don't worry, we're not done, because in the next stretch, we'll wander into even more half-truths, legends, and dynastic disasters that somehow survived the centuries. For now, let's just exhale slowly, and imagine Frederick Barbarossa still asleep under his mountain, his beard slowly tickling the stones. So, here we are again, cozy in the dim glow of medieval nonsense. Only now, instead of the definitely fake but still hilarious variety, let's talk about those oddball myths that historians rolled their eyes at for centuries, until someone dug up a bone, a manuscript, or a suspicious blood test that said, actually, yeah, that was kind of real. Because the Middle Ages, bless them, didn't really distinguish between reality and gossip, and sometimes, by sheer accident, they nailed it. Viking berserkers. Were they real or just drunk? You've probably heard of the berserkers, Viking warriors who supposedly fought in a trance, foaming at the mouth, biting their shields, and generally acting like the world's most aggressive performance artists. For a long time, historians thought this was all poetic exaggeration. Skalds, the Norse poets, were not exactly known for understatement. Surely biting the shield was just a dramatic way of saying he was a tough guy. But then, modern science chimed in. Some researchers suggest berserkers may have achieved their frenzied states using Amanita muscaria, the hallucinogenic mushroom with the classic red cap and white dots, the kind you see in Mario games. Others propose it was henbane, a toxic plant that causes delirium and aggression. So yes, they might not have been supernatural, but they weren't entirely imaginary either. Picture a bunch of large, hairy Norsemen, high on mushrooms, storming into battle while gnawing their shields. Suddenly the myth feels less like fantasy and more like Scandinavia's worst rave. The Dancing Plague of 1518. Now, this one technically isn't medieval, it's early modern, but it has medieval energy, so we'll count it. The myth goes, in Strasbourg in 1518, people started dancing uncontrollably in the streets. Not fun dancing, not Beyoncé dancing. More like twitchy, compulsive, hours-long convulsions. The story says hundreds joined in, some collapsing, some even dying from exhaustion. For a while, historians thought this was just a moralistic fable, a warning about sin or hysteria. But nope. Records from Strasbourg City Council confirm it. Doctors were summoned. Remedies were attempted. People danced themselves into the ground. Modern explanations range from mass hysteria to ergot, poisoning. That's a hallucinogenic mold that grows on rye. Basically medieval LSD bread. So yes, the dancing plague was real. And yes, somewhere in the archives, there's a bill for musicians who were hired to play for the dancers. Because the authorities thought the only cure was to let them dance it out. Medieval solutions, always top tier. The myth of blood-drinking nobles. Alright, now let's talk about a little vampirism. Because, of course, there were all sorts of creepy rumors about nobles dabbling in blood rituals. Most famously, Elizabeth Bathory, the Hungarian countess accused of bathing in the blood of virgins to stay young. For centuries, her story was considered wildly exaggerated. And to be fair, a lot of it is. There's no proof she actually bathed in blood. That part was almost certainly propaganda cooked up by her political enemies. But the kernel of truth? She was tried for torturing and killing young women. The numbers are disputed, but witnesses at her trial described some grisly stuff. And when modern scholars dug into the records, it turned out she really was responsible for an unusual number of mysterious deaths in her household. So while the bloodbath beauty routine is probably myth, the idea that she was one of the deadliest aristocrats in history is pretty well grounded. The werewolf trials. Yes, werewolves, because why not? Throughout the late Middle Ages, especially in France and Germany, there were actual trials of men accused of turning into wolves. These weren't obscure little cases. Either big legal proceedings with confessions, witnesses, and executions. Now, did these men actually turn into wolves? No, but the records show something more chilling. Many of them confessed to acts of cannibalism and violence, probably under torture. And the werewolf myth became a way to explain what we'd now call serial killing. So, the myth of werewolves wasn't true in the supernatural sense, but it did mask very real horrors that medieval courts had no other framework to process. And when you think about it, calling someone a werewolf was almost merciful. Easier than admitting your neighbor Hans just really enjoyed eating people. Giants in old bones. Finally, let's float over to one of my favorite medieval myths, giants. Everywhere you go in medieval Europe, you find stories of giant bones being dug up. Knights supposedly fought giant skeletons. Monasteries displayed giant skulls. Peasants whispered about massive warriors of old. For a long time, historians assumed these were just fables. Until paleontology came along, turns out, a lot of those giant bones were actually mammoth and mastodon fossils, or even ancient whale bones, dug up by farmers who had no idea what an elephant was. So yes, medieval people did find enormous bones. They just didn't have the science to explain them. The myth of medieval giants is basically the prequel to paleontology. And so, in this twilight zone between myth and fact, we see how the Middle Ages weren't just gullible. Sometimes they were onto something. Sometimes they were just misinterpreting evidence without the benefit of microscopes and radiocarbon dating. But either way, their myths have a way of lingering, like half-remembered dreams that keep whispering long after the candle's gone out. We've already covered coffins on tour, red-hot pokers, and bald men who maybe weren't bald. But medieval dynasties were basically myth-fact factories. If a monarch sneezed too loudly, it became a prophecy. If a queen frowned, she was accused of witchcraft. If a child prince blinked twice in a row, someone would declare him touched by angels or demons. So, let's drift through a few more of these dynastic daydreams. The princes in the tower. Let's start with England again, because the English never missed an opportunity for melodrama. You've heard of the princes in the tower. Edward Fief and his younger brother, Richard, sons of Edward IV. After their father died in 1483, their uncle, Richard III, conveniently declared them illegitimate and tucked them away in the Tower of London for their safety. And then, poof, they vanished. The myth. Richard personally had them murdered to secure his crown. Later, Tudor propaganda doubled down on this idea, painting him as a hunchbacked villain with all the subtlety of a Disney cartoon. But here's the sleepy twist. We don't actually know what happened. It's possible Richard did have them quietly killed. It's possible someone else, like Henry Tudor, tidied them away after he took the throne, and there's even the faint chance they slipped out alive. The myth of Richard the child murderer, though stuck forever, helped along by Shakespeare, who wasn't exactly known for his historical footnotes. So, was it true? Probably. But like any good bedtime story, the mystery lingers. King John and the poisoned peaches. Now, let's wander over to Richard's younger brother, John. Yes, that King John. The villain of Robin Hood stories. The guy who lost Normandy. And the man who was so unpopular that the barons forced him into signing the Magna Carta. John died in 1216. Supposedly of dysentery while running from a French invasion. But the juicier myth is that he was poisoned by a monk using peaches, or possibly cider or ale, depending on which chronicler you ask. The poisoned peaches version became especially popular, because it sounds both sinister and mildly comedic. But modern historians point out that John had been sick for weeks with classic dysentery symptoms, so the myth of a dramatic poisoning was likely just medieval wishful thinking. Even in death, no one wanted to give John a normal ending. The phantom pregnancy of Mary, sliding forward a bit, but still in that medievalish mindset. Mary Tudor, daughter of Henry VIII, better known as Bloody Mary. In 1554, she married Philip of Spain, and soon after announced she was pregnant. Court celebrations exploded. England prepared for the heir who would secure Catholic rule. Months passed. Her belly swelled. Midwives were summoned. And then, nothing. No baby, no stillbirth. Just nothing. The myth became that Mary had either faked the pregnancy or that it was some kind of divine punishment. In reality, it was probably a phantom pregnancy. Her body mimicked the symptoms, without actually carrying a child, likely due to hormonal or psychological causes. But of course, history ran with the God smote her womb narrative, because subtlety was not a Tudor specialty. The Lionheart's mummy heart. Here's a myth that turned out halfway true. When Richard the Lionheart died in 1199, his body was buried in multiple places, a common medieval practice. His body went one place, his entrails another, and his heart, well, his heart was supposedly preserved separately in Rouen. For centuries, people assumed this was just myth or exaggeration. But in 2012, researchers actually tested the dusty remains of a little box labeled as Richard's heart. And guess what? It was indeed his mummified heart, treated with spices like frankincense. So yes, Richard the Lionheart's literal heart really was floating around medieval France, pickled like some bizarre royal souvenir, because of course it was. Charles VI, the Mad King of France. And now, let's glide over to France for another royal who earned a permanent nickname. Charles VI, king from 1380 to 1422, is remembered mostly as the Mad. The myth was that Charles believed he was made of glass. Chroniclers say he wore reinforced clothing to prevent himself from shattering, and refused to be touched too roughly in case he broke. And for once, the myth is kind of true. Modern historians think Charles suffered from severe schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, and the glass delusion was a real psychiatric condition documented in the late Middle Ages. Other nobles also suffered similar episodes, but Charles's case was the most famous. So yes, there really was a king who thought he was fragile enough to smash like a wine glass. The myth, for once, lines up with reality. Sigismund and the chickens. Before we doze off completely, let's peek at Sigismund, Holy Roman Emperor in the early 15th century. He was supposed to be one of the great rulers of Europe, but the myth that clung to him was chickens. Chroniclers claimed he once declared, in a fit of linguistic confidence, that he was the king of the Romans and not the king of the grammar. This was after being mocked for misgendering, the Latin word for chicken. That one line followed him for centuries, painting him as a royal dunce. And honestly, fair. If you can conquer kingdoms but not basic nouns, maybe you deserve the myth. So here we are, poisoned peaches that weren't, phantom pregnancies that probably were, glass kings, missing princes, and hearts in spice jars. Myths and realities swirling together in the half-light of medieval memory. Royal gossip is fun, sure. But if you really want to understand the Middle Ages, you've got to step into the muddy village square. Because while kings worried about dynastic legitimacy, ordinary folks worried about things like, is my cow cursed? Will this bread attract demons? Is that weird noise outside a ghost? Or just the neighbor's drunk son again? So, let's float gently into their myths. The ones that blur the line between faith, fear, and everyday survival. The bread with a cross. One of the simplest yet most enduring beliefs was about bread. You didn't just bake it and eat it. No, you carved a cross into the top before sliding it into the oven. The myth was that it protected the loaf from evil spirits. Without that holy sign, the bread might rise badly, attract demons, or, heaven forbid, cause indigestion. And in fairness, a badly risen medieval loaf could probably knock someone unconscious. Was this true? Not really, but the practice stuck. Even today, bakers sometimes cut crosses into bread, not because we still fear flour demons, but because tradition has a funny way of outliving its origin story. The deadly night whistle. Now here's one from across Europe. Don't whistle at night. Why? Because whistling was thought to summon spirits, demons, or witches. Depending on where you were, it might even call the devil himself. In some versions, it wasn't spirits, it was snakes. Which feels even worse, honestly. Did anything ever actually happen? No. Unless you count annoying your neighbors as paranormal activity. But the fear was real enough that people tiptoed around night sounds, like they were tiptoeing around landmines. The holy corpse oil. Let's float into something a bit darker. Corpse medicine. There was a medieval belief that fat rendered from executed criminals could be turned into magical healing salves. People whispered that human grease cured wounds, eased pain, or even brought luck. Executioners sometimes sold scraps of the stuff under the table. Imagine being a medieval peasant. You can't afford a doctor. But the hangman's got a special discount on body butter. The myth of its power carried on for centuries. Was it effective? Absolutely not. Unless you count giving yourself a staph infection as healing. The evil eye. Every culture has its version of this, and medieval Europe was no exception. The idea was that a jealous glance could literally curse you, your children, or your livestock. Medieval cures included amulets, charms, or wearing certain colors. Babies were especially vulnerable, so mothers often pinned charms or beads on their clothes, because apparently nothing says protection from sorcery like a bit of string tied to your infant's bonnet. Did it work? No. But in a world without antibiotics, blaming the evil eye was easier than admitting you didn't know what caused illness. St. Elmo's fire, a myth that was actually true. Now here's a fun one that turned out to have some truth baked in. Sailors told stories of a mysterious blue flame that would appear on the tips of ship masts during storms. They called it St. Elmo's fire, believing it was a sign from heaven, sometimes of protection, sometimes of doom. And while they thought it was angelic fire, it was actually plasma, an electrical phenomenon caused by ionized air during thunderstorms. So yes, sailors really did see glowing blue fire dancing on their ships. The myth wasn't so much false as misinterpreted science with better branding. The werecat wives. In parts of France and Italy, people genuinely believed in werewolves. But there was a spin-off myth, werecats. According to folklore, women, usually suspected witches, could transform into black cats at night and sneak around, stealing or cursing livestock. Husbands who woke up and found their wives missing sometimes jumped straight to, well, obviously she's out prowling as a cat, because Why suspect infidelity when you can suspect sorcery? No proof, of course. But it gave communities a convenient excuse to accuse women of witchcraft, which, tragically, was much more dangerous than any prowling feline. The bell that stopped storms. Another lovely village myth. Ringing church bells during storms could chase away thunder. The idea was that the sound of consecrated metal would frighten the clouds. Demons or whatever force caused lightning. The awkward truth? Church towers are basically giant lightning rods. So yes, bell ringers sometimes got fried trying to protect their communities. A myth with very deadly side effects. Fairy rings and dancing circles. Finally, let's wander into the woods. If you stumbled upon a ring of mushrooms in the grass, you didn't step inside. Everyone knew that was a fairy ring. The myth was that fairies danced in those circles at night, and if you entered one, you might vanish or be forced to dance until you dropped. Today, we know fairy rings are just fungi growing in circular patterns. But to a medieval villager, they were ominous portals, which honestly sounds a lot cooler than fungal colony. The dancing plague of 1518, not just a legend. For centuries, stories about people in Strasbourg, present-day France, who suddenly started dancing uncontrollably, some even dancing to their deaths, were dismissed as wild exaggerations. It sounded more like a dark fairy tale than history. But historians digging through medical and civic records confirmed that the dancing plague of 1518 really happened. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of people began compulsively dancing in the streets for weeks. The cause is still debated. Some scholars think it was ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic fungus on rye bread. Others argue it was mass psychogenic illness triggered by extreme stress, famine, and fear of disease. Religious explanations at the time blamed divine punishment or curses. Whatever the cause, the fact remains, an uncontrollable dance mania gripped medieval Strasbourg. And it wasn't just a myth. This case shows how real history can sometimes feel stranger than fiction. The griffin bones of medieval Europe, actually fossils. In the Middle Ages, travelers and merchants often brought back enormous bones from Central Asia and the Black Sea region. Locals believed these belonged to griffins, mythical creatures with the body of a lion and the head wings of an eagle. Chroniclers even described them guarding gold in the mountains. For centuries, scholars dismissed griffins as pure legend. But modern archaeology revealed the truth. The griffin bones were actually fossilized remains of Protoceratops, a dinosaur that lived in the Gobi Desert. Its beak-like face and 4 legs resembled the descriptions of griffins. Ancient traders likely stumbled upon exposed fossils and assumed they were remains of monstrous hybrids. So, while griffins never literally existed, the myth was inspired by real prehistoric fossils discovered by medieval people long before paleontology was born, and a perfect example of how myth and science sometimes overlap. So, as we drift back from the dusty halls of medieval castles and monasteries, it's worth noticing something simple but kind of comforting. Myths weren't always just silly stories people made up because they didn't know better. A lot of the time, they were their version of science. They took what they saw, strange bones, bizarre ruins, odd illnesses, or random half-truths whispered from one traveler to another, and they stitched them into stories that explained the world around them. Sometimes, like with the griffins that were really dinosaur fossils, or the Troy that never existed until archaeologists dug it up. The old storytellers weren't that far off. Sure, they sprinkled in dragons and curses and divine punishments, because of course they did. Life in the Middle Ages was harsh. You might as well make it interesting. And honestly, that's part of the charm. Even their wildest tales had a little thread of truth woven through. So next time you hear about some ridiculous medieval rumor, like saints growing out of trees, kings turning into werewolves, or blood raining from the sky, just remember, history has a funny way of making fools of skeptics. Myths age strangely well. And with that, I think it's time to let this one fade out. Dim the lantern, close the book, and let the old myths rest for tonight. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that sometimes the unbelievable turns out to be the most real thing of all. Good night, fellow travelers.